$1,000 versus 10. How much does it really take to build amazing Warhammer terrain? Zorpazorp gave me a pile of Games Workshop kits to create a stunning building for his Edoras megaboard. But here's the twist, I'm also going to recreate it from scratch for less than $10. Can cheap materials match the detail of an expensive kit? And is the cost worth the time it takes? Let's find out. After having been sent another massive mountain of plastic crack, Lachlan from Zorpazorp lit the beacons and I answered aloft a mighty Air New Zealand Eagle.
Here we go, I've entered into the Zorpazorp headquarters. Lockie needs some help to build some Edoras buildings.
There's a lot of plastic here, I need reinforcements.
After helping him assemble some awesome buildings and travelling out to Mount Sunday in the South Island of New Zealand for some Edoras inspiration, I returned home with a sizable stack of Rohan kits.
I've never had access to so many terrain kits in my life.
$1,000 worth in fact, at least here in New Zealand. The definite downside of having such a massive pile of sprues is there is a lot of clipping and cleaning involved. So what better excuse for some daddy-daughter hobby time? She's definitely not as obsessively particular as me, but it's nice to have some company while struggling through the most mind-numbing part of the process. With all of the kits successfully clipped and cleaned, it was time for the building. And, well, I immediately hit a speed bump and started looking for inspiration on the internet. And what better source of inspo than the best Lord of the Rings video game of all time?
The Lord of the Rings, the battle for Middle-earth.
Oh, the hours I sunk into this game back in the day. So the Rohan archery range building piqued my interest. The incorporation of the tower, raised platform for the archers, and the added details of the archery targets. So with that very loose idea in mind, I started assembling my structure. These kits are beautifully detailed and modular, which makes them a lot of fun to work with, and it doesn't take too long for a big building like this to start coming together. That being said, I did have to chop into it a bit to make some of the pieces fit together that weren't designed to do so. Of course, once I started doing this, it was very hard to stop, and the freedom of working with plastic that I hadn't paid for myself was rather intoxicating. Well, that and the plastic glue fumes, probably. Okay, so I've glued the tower section in place, and now the initial idea was warriors would walk in through the door section here, and then would pop up through a trapdoor, but I don't have a trapdoor, do I? So instead, I'm going to add a ladder for which they can discernibly reach the top. For immersive gameplay, I really like to be able to see how do the warriors get up to the top. They can't just phase through a solid wooden floor, can they? Lockie and I had the idea of incorporating a building into the palisade wall itself. So to lean into this idea, I cut the spiky tops of some palisade pieces to add crenellations around the top for Rohan archers to shelter behind during an attack. Doing this meant that I had a whole lot of flat-topped palisades, so I used them as walls for a small stable. This was handy because, amazingly, I had run out of wall pieces. I actually really like the look of this. It gives the building a really rustic log cabin look. Of course, the thatch roof pieces had to be cut to fit, so I used some green stuff to mask the join. Now the warriors garrisoned here would have a place for their mounts. For the palisade wall itself, I didn't want it to be perfectly flat, and I also needed to hide the missing wall of my main building, so I cut up some pieces and added a slight rise for the wall to follow. For the base, I used a piece of XPS extruded polystyrene large enough to fit the entire layout. Some rock molds were used to give the landform a bit more interest, and then I needed to once again cut into some plastic. I used pieces of the palisade platform to create some steps down from the tower structure, and then cut some ladders to size for access points. I gave all the plastic components a coat of Rust-Oleum grey primer before fixing onto the base with hot glue. Paint was applied to the foam for no other reason than it's blue and therefore looks dumb. You may also be wondering why I did this after priming the buildings, and well, I have no logical reason for that. I used Sculptamold to blend the rock molds together and to give the flat base some subtle undulations. White paint was dry brushed over all areas of the buildings and palisades to really accentuate the textures and details before painting with my airbrush. I used a mix of wildwood, Basilicanum Grey, and Edoras dunes thinned with some contrast medium for all the areas of timber and skeleton horde for the thatch. I used a standard brush to paint the doors and windows with Militarum Green before picking out metallic details with lead boucher. The ground was all painted with a coat of burnt umber. This needed some care and a steady hand to not overspill onto the already painted buildings. I then dry brushed the rocks with light grey and decided to do the same with the timber. The dry brush helped to desaturate the colour a bit and give the buildings more of an old, worn look. A mix of tile grout and soil was added all over the base. I was not too worried about it getting onto the buildings, as this would just give them a bit of realistic grime. Some fine flock was sprinkled next. I kept the colour palette to the dry yellowish look of Rohan as depicted in the Lord of the Rings films. A full list of materials used is in the description. I sprayed a fine mist of isopropyl alcohol over the ground cover before soaking it all in matte sealant, and then used a damp paper towel to clean off the excess from the buildings. I wanted to add some more little details, so I printed some hay bales and archery targets to add to the barrels that come with the Rohan house kit. These were quickly painted using Citadel contrast paints and then glued in place. Details like this really help bring the setting to life. I then added some tufts around the walls, once again sticking to the Rohan aesthetic, with dry beige colours and some white flowers.
Well, the equivalent of $1,000 went into this, with quite a few bits left over. I'm absolutely stoked with how it looks, and I can't wait to see how it will be incorporated into the Zorpazorp megaboard. But now comes the challenge. How am I going to make this again for less than $10?
I started off with a piece of thin XPS left over from my massive modular board build, with the ridiculous and redundant idea of using it as the floor for the main building. I had the notion that the interior would be playable, and so why not texture it to look like stone? Why not? Well, because it took a stupid amount of time, that's why. Anyway, for whatever reason, this would become a recurring theme during this build. I traced the outline of the floor onto an equivalent sized piece of XPS to my expensive build and started building up the landform. Again, I'm using some leftover bits, this time in the form of some plaster cast rocks, but would now need to employ some cunning tricks because I had run out of sculptor mold. Going a little overboard, I piled some toilet paper into a tub. Luckily I had plenty.
I just want one pack.
So I didn't have to fight for them this time. Instead, I filled the tub with water, then used a stick blender to whiz the paper into a pulp. I strained out the excess water, broke up and evenly distributed the clumps on a tray to dry, gave it all another whiz until I had a dry, fluffy mass of cellulose fibres. I mixed some of this with roughly equal amounts of plaster of Paris and gave it a shake. Voila! Modelling compound that costs nothing but time and a possible assault charge. Just like the sculptor mould, I used it to blend the rocks and smooth the joins of the small hill. To make the structures, I used packaging cardboard destined for recycling. I measured each wall and roof section to match the size of the buildings before carefully cutting them out with a sharp retractable blade. Once I had all the pieces I needed, I stuck them together with hot glue. Unfortunately, this is when I realised I hadn't measured as accurately as I'd hoped, and the end wall didn't fit properly. So I cut some XPS strips, which I textured with a pencil to look like the wood grain of structural posts, and glued them into the corner gaps. Continuing the ultimately redundant and unnecessary idea of interior playability, I glued magnets onto strips of cardboard. These would allow me to easily remove and reattach the roof section, allowing access to the bottom floor. Okay, now you may be crying foul by now because surely we're going beyond the $10 threshold. Well, each magnet is less than 10 cents, so not exactly an outrageous expense, and besides being very attractive, don't really affect the look of the project at all, and well, I'm just hoping you'll forgive this unnecessary indulgence. The tower section was made in the same way, except that this time the top platform would not use magnets, and instead had strips of cardboard to anchor it in place. Continuing the trend of unnecessary additions, I cut out an access hole through which warriors can reach the top level, along with arrow slits in the tower walls. Over lunch I pondered where I would source cheap materials for the timber.
Well, time for some texturing.
Thankfully that epiphany actually occurred a significant time in the past, and so my love of sushi and coffee has resulted in the accumulation of a significant stockpile of miniature lumber. They all needed to be whittled with a blade for a lovely weathered texture. Actually a lot of effort as it turns out, because silly me decided the sticks didn't look wooden enough, so I painstakingly scrubbed them all with a wire brush. Here you can see the difference in texture. Time would tell whether that would actually translate once painted.
Okay, now that I've got hundreds of these coffee stirrers all weathered and ready to go, it's time to glue them onto my structure.
Actually, before I do that, I need to make sure the positioning was right. So I fixed the XPS floor to the base with PVA glue and made sure the building would fit. Then I gave the base a lick of paint, once again priming with black and then a base coat of burnt umber. I used clippers to snip the rounded ends off and cut them to the right size, working in batches to try and be efficient. I made arrow slit frames using matchsticks clipped to size. I added black paint into the glue for some reason. I think it kind of made sense at the time. I used plenty of PVA to fix them in place because with a little whittle each stick will be brittle. So yeah, they needed to be attached firmly. Not going to lie, this took a long time. So much clipping and gluing, whittling and snipping and measuring. Lots and lots of measuring. The time and effort was beginning to take its toll. But I settled into a rhythm, hot gluing in place framing planks, measuring one plank to fit within the frame, then using that as a guide to clip the rest before gluing them all in to fill the space. I brushed away any excess glue that oozed up between the planks with a damp brush. I didn't want dried glue to ruin the look of the wooden panelling. Adding the arrow slits added some complexity which slowed everything down, but I trusted that the extra details would be worth it in the end. Now that all the timber panelling was attached, it was time to add some details. For the doors I cut some thin balsa wood to size and used the wire brush to scrub in more texture. I then cut plank grooves with a craft knife before accentuating with a sharp pencil. To make a door handle, I cut a couple of rings off of a cheap chain necklace. I cut one of the rings in half, threaded it through the other ring and then pressed it firmly into the balsa wood door. Gluing the door into the frame was a real pain. Originally I had the insane idea to make them openable, but after the hours already put into this project, I scratched that. With this version I will have a trapdoor, so I left a space for it when gluing the planks to the tower platform. The trapdoor was made similarly to the doors, and I carefully added some matchstick detailing. I really love adding these characterful little details because it just adds so much character and believability to the terrain. Okay, now it was time to tackle the thatching. I used some cereal box cardboard as a base and then sacrificed and skinned one of my daughter's teddy bears. The fur was cut to size and then attached using hot glue. I thinned some PVA with water and then thoroughly soaked the fur with it. Next, I would need to work on the palisade crenellations.
Well, here we go again.
It really felt like I was close to finishing at this point. But it turns out this took a stupid amount of time, so those feelings of imminent completion were dashed against the rocks of my need to keep things aesthetically consistent. Each chopstick was carefully whittled to look like felled tree logs sharpened to points. They were each cut to size to match the look of the plastic palisade kit and then fixed to the structure using hot glue. I have been described as somewhat obsessional, a rather unfair observation. I applied all the same steps to the smaller stable building, once again making efforts to have it look very similar to the expensive build. With the structures finished, it was time to build the palisade wall, and consequently a little bit more effort. Realising that it would be much more difficult once the wall was glued in place, I base coated the buildings and then began the task of fixing each individual log. Again, I carefully measured each log to match the look of the official plastic kit, then added the fire step for Rohan warriors to defend their city.
Okay, this is a quick interruption to firstly say thanks so much for watching this far, and if you found any value in it, then please do hit like and subscribe for more mad terrain builds and ways to save hobby dollars. And finally, if you'd like to support the channel and the content I create, then please do consider joining my Patreon. For as little as the price of a coffee each month, patrons gain access to my Discord server where you can connect directly with me, as well as seeing regular work in progress shots. I'll see you there, but for now, let's get back to some more stick whittling madness.
It would have been a lot faster to paint all of this with my airbrush, but I wanted to stick to the budget theme, and so instead used a standard brush and used cheap acrylic paints. I based everything with burnt umber and then applied a heavy dry brush of raw sienna. This was then mixed with some light grey, which I dry brushed lightly to pick out the raised details. The thatch was all painted with yellow ochre, and then I mixed in some white and dry brushed the fur to highlight the texture. I applied ground cover in exactly the same way as the first build and sealed using my cheap homemade matte sealant. For a professional finish, I touched up the sides of the base with black paint. I started making some scratch built archery targets and then decided, no, Adam, you've already spent way too long on this project. So I resigned myself to just adding some old brush bristles that I'd cut out in clumps to represent hay for the horses, along with some scratch built ladders. Despite the addition of the tufts, this definitely fits within the $10 budget. There is some inherent value in the satisfaction of building something from scratch, and at first glance it is difficult to tell the difference between these two builds. That being said, it costs a great deal more in time. It does also have the potential for interior gameplay, which the expensive version does not.
Now I just need to pack one of these up and send it down to the Zorpazorp headquarters. Make sure you check out how he will incorporate it into his Edoras megaboard, and I'll see you next time at 3D Games.